Greetings, math students. It's time for another flip math lesson with Mr. Valleau. And today we are going to be looking at factoring polynomials, specifically factoring trinomials in the form of x squared plus bx plus c, where x squared is our leading monomial and that it has a degree of 2. So your traditional trinomial with x squared plus bx plus c. And what we're going to do is there's a lot of literal equation stuff to go over in the first part of this, and you're going to see that our factor is going to result in two binomials. So we're going to take this trinomial apart and we're going to make it into two distinct binomials. And they're going to lead, both of them are going to lead with x, because in this case, the x term is what is squared. So that's going to be our leading monomial here. And then we have created term p here, and term q here to represent the additional terms in the binomial that combine to make the trinomial terms b, x, and c. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at two different equations here, two different things. And the first is that when we begin to factor, we need to note that p and q are distinct and that p and q combine to make b and c. So what's going to happen is that p and q, p plus q, will be equal to b, and p times q will be equal to c. So really what you're shooting for is a number that will multiply, or two numbers that will multiply together to give you the constant term in a trinomial, and that will add together to give you that single degree monomial in the middle of the trinomial. So we're going to start off with an example, and we're going to factor x squared plus 9x plus 14. And remember, we're going to create two distinct binomials that are going to be multiplied together to give us our factoring. And we're going to make sure that we have this b and this c are going to be what dictate our second number in our monomial. And those are going to let us know it'll multiply to give us 14 and add to give us 9. Now, the first thing is we'll notice that both of the signs in the trinomial are positive. So we can say that both signs in the binomials will be positive. And we know we have x squared, so our leading term in each of the binomials will be x. So now what we have to do is we have to figure out those trailing numbers. And the way we do that is we start to list our factors. And you'll become more natural at this as you go through and as you practice. But for now, let's just start to list our factors. So we have 1 and 14. Now 1 and 14 multiply together to give you 14, but add to give you 15. So we're not where we need to be yet. Well, the other factor of 14 is 2 and 7, and it just so happens that 2 and 7 add together to give you 9. So we know that we have found our correct factor terms for our two separate binomials. And now we have to look at order. And really, order doesn't matter as long as we're dealing with both positive numbers. So we can just simply say x plus 2 and x plus 7. Now from here, we have factored our trinomial into two distinct binomials. And as we talked about last time, it's very easy from this point to set that equal to 0. And from there, know that our two x-intercepts would be -2 and -7. So you can even take it a step further and be able to solve. Now let's look at what happens when you're factoring and b is a negative number and c is positive. So an interesting thing happens when b is negative and c is positive. What you're going to have, let's correct this. When b is negative, and c is positive. What you're going to have to do is, remember, you've got p and q will have to multiply together to give you c, and add together to give you b. So the only way you're going to multiply to get a positive number and add to get a negative number is that p and q must both be negative. So let's give this another go at factoring and figuring out what our two binomials will be. So to begin, we'll have to have our factors of 27 and our sums. So let's put together our chart here. And we know that first, going into 27, we have 1 and 27. And remember, they're going to both need to be negative, because we learned that from the rule. Well, negative 1 plus negative 27 is negative 28. So that's not going to work for us. And we also have, let's see, our next factor is going to be next factor is going to be 3, and 3 and 9 are our factors there. And so we know negative 3 and negative 9 will give us positive 27, and we'll add together to give us a negative 12. So again, we have found our factor terms that fit the criteria. And putting together our two distinct binomials, we know that we're going to lead with x, because that's what gives us our second degree monomial in the front of the trinomial. And then we've got a negative 3 and a negative 9. And from there, again, we have factored out successfully the trinomial x squared minus 12x plus 27. And you can check this using your FOIL method. So if we go first terms, we'll have x squared. Our outer terms will give us negative 9x. Our inner terms will result in negative 3x. And our last terms will result in 27. So combining like terms, you end up with x squared minus 12x plus 27. And we know that we have then checked our work. Finally, what we're going to look at is when we are factoring and c is a negative number. Now, on the last one, when we had b as a negative number, both p and q had to be the same sign. They had to be negative, because that's the only way it would work. Well, in this case, p and q are going to have different signs, because that's the only way you are going to end up with a negative 8. So you're going to have one that is positive and one that is negative. So this gets slightly trickier, because at this point, you're going to have a number that will subtract to result in your middle term. So our target, when we begin to factor, is that we're looking for negative 8 and a positive 7. So let's start off and let's look at our factors. So if we do 1 and 8 are factors, and let's say that 8 is the negative. Now, if 8 is the negative, the sum would be negative 7. Okay, well, we know that's pretty close, but what we need is a positive 7. So instead, let's say that the 1 is the negative term. So we do negative 1 and 8. And 8 plus a negative 1 is 7. And we have found our factored terms. And then we begin to construct our two binomials. We have our x as the lead, a negative 1 in the first pair, and x plus 8 in the second. And then again, to check our work, we use our FOIL method. We have x squared plus 8x minus x minus 8. And then combining like terms, you can see that this does indeed check out with our original trinomial.